The iron shackles around Violet's wrists had worn her skin raw during the 3-day journey to Black Hawk, Colorado. But the physical pain meant nothing compared to the agony of watching her younger sister Victoria being dragged away toward a different wagon that morning in 1876. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and mountain snow as their captors had separated them at dawn, and Violet had screamed until her throat bled, fighting against the rough hands that held her back while Victoria's terrified cries grew fainter in the distance. Their parents had died 6 months earlier, when cholera swept through their small farm outside of Denver, leaving 19-year-old Violet and 17-year-old Victoria alone in a world that devoured vulnerable young women without mercy. The banker had come first, claiming their land for unpaid debts Violet had never known existed. Then came the men in dark coats who promised work in a mining town, who smiled with tobacco-stained teeth and spoke of respectable employment in a boarding house. Violet had known better, had seen the truth in their cold eyes, but starvation makes people desperate. She had negotiated fiercely, demanding they take her alone and leave Victoria behind with the church, but the men had laughed and taken them both anyway. The auction block in Black Hawk stood in the center of town, a crude wooden platform that had seen too many souls sold like cattle. Violet stood there now, her dark hair tangled and her green eyes burning with defiance despite the fear that threatened to consume her. The auctioneer, a portly man with whiskey on his breath, grabbed her arm and displayed her to the crowd of miners and merchants who had gathered in the afternoon sun. The mountains rose majestically around the town, indifferent to the human misery unfolding in their shadow. "Fine specimen here, gentlemen," the auctioneer called out. "Young, strong, good teeth. Contract for 5 years of labor. Do I hear $50? Violet wanted to spit in his face, wanted to fight, but she had learned during the journey that resistance only brought the whip. She scanned the crowd desperately, searching for any sign of Victoria, praying her sister was somewhere nearby. The faces before her blurred together, rough men with calculating eyes who looked at her like she was horseflesh. 75, called a voice from the back. 100, countered another, closer to the platform. Violet's stomach churned. These men were buying years of her life, purchasing the right to work her until her hands bled and her back broke. Some would be crueler than others. Some would expect more than just labor. She had heard the whispered stories during the journey, tales that made her blood run cold. Then she saw him. A tall man standing apart from the crowd, his broad-shouldered frame clad in worn leather and denim, a black hat shadowing his face. Unlike the others who pressed forward eagerly, he stood perfectly still, his posture rigid with what looked like controlled anger. When he removed his hat, Violet saw a strong jaw covered in dark stubble, intense blue eyes that met hers for just a moment, and something in that brief connection made her breath catch. 100 going once, the auctioneer announced. The tall man stepped forward, his boots striking the dirt with purpose. $200, he said, his voice deep and clear, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. A hush fell over the gathering. $200 was an outrageous sum for a labor contract, more than twice what most paid. The other bidders turned to stare at this newcomer who had just priced them out of the competition. $200 from the gentleman, the auctioneer said, unable to hide his surprise and greed. Do I hear $225? The crowd remained silent. The man who had bid 100 shook his head and stepped back, muttering under his breath. 200 going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in black. Violet's legs trembled as the auctioneer unchained her from the post and pushed her toward the tall stranger. She stumbled down the platform steps, her muscles weak from days of poor food and little water, Strong hands caught her before she fell, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Easy there," the man said quietly. His eyes were the color of a summer sky, and up close she could see a thin scar running along his left temple. "Can you walk?" "Yes," Violet managed, though her voice came out as barely a whisper. "My sister. They have my sister somewhere. Her name is Victoria. Please, I need to find her." Something flickered across the man's face, a tightening around his eyes that might have been sympathy or anger or both. "Your sister was sold here too, this morning. They separated us. She's only 17. Please, I'll work twice as hard. I'll do anything you ask, but please help me find her." The man studied her face for a long moment, and Violet saw him make some kind of decision. "What's your name, Violet?" "Violet Grayson." "Harrison Zeller," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that seemed oddly courteous given the circumstances. "Come on. We need to find your sister before some bastard takes her too far from town." Hope surged through Violet's chest so powerfully it hurt. "You'll help me." "I didn't buy you to watch you suffer," Harrison said grimly. He guided her away from the auction block, one hand lightly on her elbow, supporting but not gripping. "Do you know anything about who bought her? What they looked like?" Violet shook her head, fighting back tears. "They put me in a different wagon this morning. I heard her screaming my name, but I couldn't see which direction they went." Harrison's jaw clenched. He led Violet down the main street of Black Hawk, past saloons and supply stores, past the assay office and the livery stable. The town clung to the mountainside, built in haphazard stages as the gold and silver boom had drawn thousands of fortune seekers to Colorado territory. The streets were muddy from recent rain, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings. "The auction house keeps records," Harrison said. "They have to document the sales for the territorial government. We'll start there." They entered a small office attached to the auction platform, where a clerk sat behind a battered desk covered in papers. The man looked up with watery eyes magnified behind thick spectacles. "Help you?" he asked in a nasal voice. "I need information about a girl sold this morning," Harrison said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Victoria Grayson, 17 years old. Who bought her contract?" The clerk's eyes darted between Harrison and Violet, then fixed on something behind Harrison's left shoulder. Violet felt Harrison tense beside her. "That information is private business between buyer and the auction house," the clerk said nervously. Harrison reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold coin, setting it on the desk with a solid thunk that made the clerk's eyes widen. "I'm making it my business." The clerk licked his lips, glancing again at whatever he saw behind them. Violet turned and saw 3 men had followed them into the office, rough-looking characters with guns on their hips and mean expressions on their faces. The largest one, a bear of a man with a thick red beard, grinned at her with broken teeth. "That's my property you're talking about," the bearded man said. "Paid good money for that little filly this morning. She's already on her way to my claim up in the hills." Violet's blood turned to ice. Harrison shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself between Violet and the 3 men. His hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his own gun, worn low on his right hip. "Your claim," Harrison repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "You planning to work her in a mine?" The bearded man laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Something like that. She'll earn back what I paid for her one way or another. Now, you bought yourself a woman today too, so you got no call interfering with my business." "I'm calling it interference," Harrison said. "Name your price. I'll buy her contract from you." The bearded man's grin widened. "She ain't for sale. I like them young and spirited. This one fought like a wildcat when we loaded her up. Gonna enjoy breaking her in." Violet felt rage and terror war within her chest. "You monster," she breathed. "Besides," the bearded man continued, ignoring Violet entirely, "even if she was for sale, you couldn't afford her. I paid $300 for that contract. You got that kind of money just lying around, Cowboy, $300. An astronomical sum." Violet's hope, which had blazed so bright moments ago, began to crumble. She looked at Harrison and saw his mind working behind those blue eyes, calculating odds and options. 300, Harrison said slowly. "You got a bill of sale?" The bearded man's grin faltered slightly. "Course I do." "Show me." "I don't have to show you nothing." Harrison turned to the clerk. "Territorial law says all contracts for indentured labor have to be registered within 24 hours of purchase, with copies filed at the territorial office. That right?" The clerk nodded nervously, still eyeing the gold coin on his desk. "So if this gentleman bought the girl this morning, you should have the paperwork right here. Let me see it." The clerk hesitated, then pulled open a drawer and withdrew a thin sheaf of papers. He shuffled through them, pulled one out and held it up. "Sale of labor contract for one Victoria Grayson to Caleb Morton, $300, term of 5 years. "Let me see the payment receipt," Harrison said. "Now hold on," Caleb Morton protested. "You got no right, the receipt," Harrison repeated, steel in his voice. The clerk found another paper and read it, his brow furrowing. "Says here payment was made with a promissory note, to be paid in full within 30 days. Harrison's expression didn't change, but Violet saw a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "So you haven't actually paid for her yet?" Caleb Morton's face flushed red beneath his beard. "I put up the note. It's as good as gold. Then you won't mind if I cover it right now." Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather pouch. He opened it and began counting gold coins onto the clerk's desk, the metallic clinks filling the tense silence. Violet stared in disbelief as the pile grew. 20 coins. 30. 40. "That's $500, Harrison said when he finished counting. 300 to buy out Morton's promissory note, and 200 for his trouble and compensation for his trip back down the mountain. The contract transfers to me." The office had gone completely silent except for the sound of someone breathing heavily, which Violet realized was herself. $500. This stranger, this man she had met less than an hour ago, was offering $500 to save a girl he had never even met. Caleb Morton's face had gone from red to purple. His hand twitched toward his gun. "You trying to make me look like a fool?" "I'm trying to buy a contract," Harrison said calmly. "Business transaction, nothing personal. You walk out of here with $200 profit for an hour's work. Seems like a good deal to me. And if I say no, then I'll follow you up to your claim and we'll discuss it there. But that conversation probably won't end with you making a profit." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Violet could see Caleb Morton weighing his options, his small eyes flicking between the gold on the desk and Harrison's unwavering stance. The two men flanking Morton looked nervous now, clearly not eager to draw against someone who carried himself with such lethal confidence. Finally, Morton spat on the floor and jerked his head toward the door. "She ain't worth the trouble. Keep the girl. But you're making enemies today, Cowboy. People remember things in these mountains." "I'm counting on it," Harrison said quietly. Morton and his men left, their boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. Violet felt her legs give out and she grabbed the edge of the desk to keep from falling. Harrison's hand was at her elbow again, steady and warm. "Where is she?" Harrison asked the clerk, who was staring at the gold coins like they might vanish if he blinked. "Where did Morton leave the girl?" "Livery stable," the clerk said quickly. "He put her in the tack room under guard while he came to file the papers." "But if you're taking over the contract, Draw up the transfer papers. Now." The clerk's hands shook as he prepared the documents, dipping his pen in ink and scratching out the necessary forms. Violet watched in a daze as Harrison signed his name with a firm hand, as money changed possession, as her sister's fate shifted from nightmare to something that looked almost like hope. When the papers were complete, Harrison took the contract and tucked it inside his jacket. Then he turned to Violet, and she saw something in his face that made her throat tighten. Not lust, not ownership, but a fierce protectiveness that she didn't understand. "Let's go get your sister," he said. They hurried through the streets as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks. Violet's heart hammered against her ribs. Victoria was close, so close. After hours of terror and separation, they would be together again. She wanted to run, but her weakened body could only manage a fast walk, and Harrison matched her pace without complaint. The livery stable smelled of horses and hay and leather. A young man sat on a barrel outside the tack room, whittling a piece of wood with a knife. He looked up as they approached, wariness crossing his face. "Caleb Morton sent us," Harrison said smoothly. "Contract's been transferred. We're here to collect the girl." The guard frowned. "Morton didn't say nothing about that." Harrison pulled out the contract papers and showed them to the guard. "It's all legal. You can ride up to his claim and check if you want, but he's not going to be happy about you bothering him." The guard studied the papers, clearly unable to read well but unwilling to admit it. Finally, he shrugged and stood, unlocking the tack room door. "She's all yours. Good luck with her. She bites." Violet pushed past Harrison and into the dim room. Victoria sat huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, her blonde hair falling across her face. She looked up with red-rimmed eyes, and when she saw Violet, her expression transformed from despair to disbelief to joy in the space of a heartbeat. "Violet." Victoria scrambled to her feet and threw herself into her sister's arms. They collided in a fierce embrace, both of them crying now, holding each other like they might be torn apart again at any moment. Violet breathed in the familiar scent of her sister's hair and felt something break open inside her chest, relief and love and gratitude flooding through her in waves that made her dizzy. "I thought I'd lost you," Victoria sobbed against Violet's shoulder. "I thought I'd never see you again." "I'm here," Violet whispered fiercely. "I'm here and we're together now. We're going to be okay." She looked up and saw Harrison standing in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, giving them their moment. This man who had spent $700 to reunite two sisters he didn't know. This stranger who had faced down Caleb Morton and his thugs without hesitation. Violet met his eyes and saw him nod once, a small gesture that seemed to say everything and nothing at once. When Victoria finally pulled back, Violet turned her sister to face their unlikely savior. "Victoria, this is Harrison Zeller. He bought our contracts. He saved us." Victoria stared at Harrison with wide hazel eyes, taking in his tall frame and serious face. "Why?" she asked, the question soft and confused. "Why would you do that for us?" Harrison shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "Let's get you both somewhere safe first, then we can talk about the why." He led them out of the livery stable and down a side street to a small boarding house with faded paint and flower boxes in the windows. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes answered his knock, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Harrison Zeller, as I live and breathe," she said warmly. "I heard you were back in Black Hawk. What brings you to my door?" "Hello, Mrs. Patterson, I need a favor. These two young ladies need a room, a hot meal, and some decent clothes. Can you help me out?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes moved to Violet and Victoria, and her expression shifted to understanding and compassion. "Of course. Come in, dears. You look half-starved. "Harrison, you staying for supper?" "Can't tonight. I need to take care of some business, but I'll be back in the morning." He touched his hat brim again, that same courteous gesture. "You're safe here. Mrs. Patterson runs the most respectable boarding house in Black Hawk. Get some rest." Before Violet could thank him, before she could ask the 100 questions racing through her mind, Harrison was gone, his long strides carrying him back into the street and out of sight. Mrs. Patterson ushered them inside, clucking over their torn dresses and thin faces. She led them upstairs to a small but clean room with 2 narrow beds and a window overlooking the street. Hot water appeared, along with soap and towels, and Violet and Victoria took turns washing away days of grime and fear. Clean dresses materialized, simple calico but infinitely better than their ruined clothes. Then came food, more food than Violet had seen in months. Beef stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread, apple pie with cream. They ate until their stomachs hurt, until Victoria actually laughed, the sound strange and wonderful after so much darkness. Only then, sitting on the beds in the lamplight, did they finally talk about what had happened. "I thought they were going to kill you," Victoria said quietly. "When they split us up this morning, I thought I'd never see you alive again." "I thought the same about you," Violet admitted. She reached across the space between the beds and took her sister's hand. "But we're here, we're alive, and somehow we found someone who helped us." "Who is he?" Victoria asked. "This Harrison Zeller. Why would he spend so much money on strangers?" Violet shook her head. "I don't know, but tomorrow I'm going to find out." Sleep came easier than it had any right to, exhaustion dragging them both under despite the strangeness of their situation. Violet's last conscious thought was of blue eyes and a quiet voice saying, "I'm making it my business." Morning sun streamed through the window when Violet woke to the sound of voices downstairs. She dressed quickly and found Victoria already up, brushing out her long hair by the window. Together, they went down to the dining room where Mrs. Patterson was serving breakfast to her boarders. Harrison sat at a corner table, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him. In the daylight, Violet could see him more clearly. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 25 or 26, with strong features and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. He stood when they entered, and Violet noticed he moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in his own body. "Morning," he said. "Sleep well. Better than we have in months," Violet admitted. She and Victoria sat across from him, and Mrs. Patterson brought them plates of eggs and bacon and fried potatoes. For a few minutes, they ate in silence, the morning bustle of the boarding house flowing around them. Finally, Violet set down her fork and looked Harrison directly in the eye. "We need to talk about what happens now." Harrison nodded slowly. "I figured you'd have questions." "I'm grateful," Violet said carefully. "More grateful than I can possibly express. You saved both of us yesterday. But I need to understand what you expect from us, what the terms of these contracts actually mean." Harrison took a long drink of his coffee, as if gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only they could hear. 5 years ago, my sister Ellen was traveling west with her husband. They were attacked by bandits outside of Pueblo. Her husband was killed. Ellen was taken. By the time I tracked her down, she'd been sold to a mining camp as what they call a soiled dove. She'd been there for 3 months. Violet felt her breath catch. Victoria's hand found hers under the table. "I bought her out," Harrison continued, his eyes distant. "Brought her back to my ranch, but she never really recovered. The things they did to her in those 3 months broke something inside. Last winter, she walked out into a snowstorm and didn't come back. We found her body in the spring." "I'm so sorry," Violet whispered. Harrison's jaw tightened. When I came to Black Hawk yesterday, I was here to sell cattle to the mining camps. I saw the auction happening in the town square, saw those men bidding on that girl like she was livestock. And all I could think was, that could have been Ellen. That could have been my sister if someone had stepped in sooner. He finally met Violet's eyes. So I stepped in. And then you told me about Victoria, and I thought, what's the point of saving one sister if I leave the other one to the same fate? Violet felt tears burning behind her eyes. So what do you want from us? You own our contracts. Legally, we have to work for you for 5 years. Legally, Harrison agreed. But I don't hold with slavery, indentured or otherwise. Here's what I'm proposing. I have a ranch about 15 miles north of here, up in the high country. It's good land, but it's a lot of work for one man. I need help running it. You both work for me, honest ranch work, cooking and cleaning and helping with the animals. I pay you fair wages, $10 a month each. You save your money, and when you've saved enough to strike out on your own, I tear up the contracts and you go with my blessing. Violet stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You'd let us go, just like that. When you're ready, Harrison confirmed. Could take a year, could take the full 5, depending on what you want to do with your lives. But you'd go as free women with money in your pockets and skills to support yourselves. And in the meantime, you'd have a safe place to live and regular meals and no one bothering you. Victoria spoke for the first time. Why would you do this? You could force us to work for nothing. You could. You could do a lot of things. What's to stop you? Harrison's face hardened. What's to stop me is that I was raised to treat people with decency. My father would have horsewhipped me if I'd turned out the kind of man who takes advantage of women in trouble. And my sister's memory would haunt me if I became the kind of person who could have helped and didn't. Violet felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun streaming through the windows. She studied Harrison's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden cruelty, but found only honest determination. This man had spent $700 and made a dangerous enemy yesterday, and now he was offering them not just salvation but dignity. I accept, Violet said. And I promise you, we'll work harder than any ranch hands you've ever had. Victoria nodded. Thank you. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. You'll repay me by building good lives for yourselves, Harrison said. He stood and placed a few coins on the table to cover the meal. We'll leave this afternoon. I've got a wagon outside already loaded with supplies. The ranch is a fair ride, but we should make it before dark if we leave soon. They spent the morning preparing for the journey. Mrs. Patterson provided them with sturdy traveling clothes and good boots, accepting payment from Harrison with a knowing look that suggested she understood more than was being said. Violet and Victoria packed their few belongings into a small trunk Harrison provided, and by early afternoon, they were seated in a supply wagon heading north out of Black Hawk. The road climbed steadily into the mountains, winding through stands of aspen and pine. September had touched the aspens with gold, and the air smelled crisp and clean, so different from the smoky desperation of the mining town. Harrison drove the wagon with easy competence, pointing out landmarks as they traveled. That peak there is Mount Evans, he said, indicating a massive summit to the south. And we're heading toward the Williams Fork Valley. My ranch sits at about 9,000 feet, so the winters are rough, but the summers are perfect. Water's good, grass is good, and the cattle thrive. How big is your ranch? Victoria asked. She sat between Violet and Harrison on the wagon seat, her earlier wariness beginning to thaw in the face of Harrison's matter-of-fact kindness. 320 acres, Harrison said with obvious pride. I homesteaded it 4 years ago, built the cabin and barn myself. Got about 50 head of cattle right now, plus chickens and a few horses. It's not much compared to the big spreads down in the flatlands, but it's mine, clear and free." As they traveled, Violet found herself watching Harrison from the corner of her eye. She noticed the way his hands held the reins with gentle firmness, the way he spoke to the horses with affection rather than harshness. She saw how he scanned the tree line constantly, alert but not anxious, a man comfortable in wild country. And she noticed how, when Victoria shivered in the cooling mountain air, he stopped the wagon without being asked and retrieved a blanket from the supplies, draping it over her shoulders with the same casual care he showed the horses. The sun was low in the sky when they finally turned off the main road onto a narrow track that led through a meadow dotted with wildflowers. Violet saw the cabin first, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Behind it stood a barn, smaller but well-built, and beyond that, a corral where several horses lifted their heads to watch the wagon approach. "Welcome to the Rocking Z," Harrison said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. The ranch was beautiful in a stark, honest way. The cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by pine-covered slopes, with a creek running silver through the meadow. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The whole place had an air of peaceful isolation, as if the rest of the world and all its ugliness existed somewhere far away and couldn't touch this hidden sanctuary. Harrison helped them down from the wagon and led them inside. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cast iron stove stood in the kitchen area, and simple but sturdy furniture filled the space. Everything was clean and orderly, though clearly the home of a man living alone. "I'll sleep in the barn," Harrison said, setting their trunk down. "You two take the cabin. There's a loft up there with a bed, and I can build another one down here by the fireplace. The privy's out back, water pump is by the kitchen door. Make yourselves at home." "You don't have to sleep in the barn," Violet protested. "We can figure out something else." "You need privacy and safety," Harrison said firmly. "I'll be comfortable in the barn. I've slept in worse places, believe me." He showed them where everything was stored, how to work the stove, where he kept the root cellar and the smokehouse. As the last light faded from the sky, he built up the fire in the fireplace and set a pot of beans to warm on the stove. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said, reaching for his hat. "If you need anything during the night, ring the bell by the door and I'll come running. Otherwise, I'll see you at sunrise. We've got a full day's work ahead of us tomorrow." After he left, Violet and Victoria stood in the middle of the cabin, looking at each other in the firelight. The events of the past 2 days seemed impossible, a dream or a nightmare or both at once. "You trust him?" Victoria asked quietly. Violet thought about the question carefully. "I think so. I think he's exactly what he appears to be, a good man who did a good thing." "Those are rare," Victoria said, her voice carrying the weight of recent trauma. "I know. But maybe we got lucky." Violet moved to the window and looked out toward the barn where lamplight glowed in a single window. "Or maybe he's the one who got lucky, getting 2 hard-working women for his ranch." Victoria managed a small smile. "We'll earn our keep, starting tomorrow." They ate the simple meal of beans and bread, washed their dishes in the basin, and climbed to the loft where a large bed waited with clean quilts and soft pillows. Violet lay awake long after Victoria's breathing deepened into sleep, staring up at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling and thinking about blue eyes and calloused hands, and a man who had turned his own grief into salvation for strangers. The next morning began before dawn when Harrison rang the bell by the door. Violet and Victoria rose quickly, dressed in their new work clothes, and found Harrison outside with buckets for milking. "The cow is named Bessie," Harrison said, leading them to the barn. "She's temperamental in the mornings, but she'll behave if you talk to her nice. One of you can milk while the other helps me feed the horses and chickens." Thus began their education in ranch life. Violet took to the work with determination, learning to milk Bessie despite the cow's initial suspicion, while Victoria scattered grain for the chickens and gathered eggs. Harrison moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, teaching them as he worked, patient with their mistakes and generous with his praise. After breakfast, which they cooked together in the cabin, Harrison took them on a tour of the property. He showed them the cattle grazing in the high meadow, explained how he rotated them between pastures to keep the grass healthy. He pointed out where he'd seen bear sign and warned them to make noise when walking in the woods. He demonstrated how to work the pump without breaking it, how to chop kindling without taking off a finger, how to latch the chicken coop so foxes couldn't get in. The work was hard, harder than anything Violet had done on their small farm. Her muscles ached, her hands blistered, and by the end of the first day she could barely climb the ladder to the loft. But it was honest work, satisfying work, and she fell asleep that night with a sense of accomplishment rather than dread. Days turned into weeks, and a routine established itself. The sisters rose with the sun and worked until darkness fell. They learned to cook on the temperamental stove, to bake bread that didn't burn, to preserve vegetables from the garden for winter. Harrison taught them to ride horses, to throw a rope, to recognize the signs of sick cattle. He taught them to shoot, standing behind them at the makeshift range he'd set up behind the barn, guiding their hands on the old rifle until they could hit a tin can at 30 paces. "Every woman in this country should know how to handle a gun," Harrison said. "I won't always be around to protect you." As September gave way to October, the aspens turned gold and the nights grew cold. Harrison brought the cattle down from the high meadows and began preparing the ranch for winter. He repaired the barn roof, chinked gaps in the cabin walls, and stocked the woodshed with enough fuel to last until spring. Violet found herself watching him constantly. She noticed how he always served them first at meals, taking the smallest portion for himself. How he never entered the cabin without knocking first, respecting their privacy even though he owned the building. How he worked from dawn to dusk without complaint, then spent his evenings carving small wooden figures by the barn lantern light. One evening in late October, as the first snow of the season dusted the mountain peaks, Violet brought Harrison's dinner out to the barn. She found him in the tack room, oiling saddles by lamplight. "You don't have to eat out here," she said, handing him the plate. "It's cold. You should come inside where it's warm." Harrison took the plate with a nod of thanks. "I don't want to intrude." "You wouldn't be intruding, it's your home." "Right now it's your home," Harrison said. "You and Victoria need space to heal. I've seen it before with Ellen. After what happened to her, she couldn't stand having men too close. Even me, and I was her brother. She needed distance and safety." Violet sat down on a hay bale, studying his face in the flickering light. "What happened to us was terrible, but we're not broken. We're not so fragile that we can't have dinner with the man who saved our lives." Harrison met her eyes, and Violet saw something there she hadn't noticed before. Not just kindness, but loneliness. This man had been living alone since his sister's death, carrying his grief in solitude. "Please," Violet said softly, "come inside. Let us thank you by sharing a warm meal." After a long moment, Harrison nodded. "All right, but only if Victoria's comfortable with it." Victoria was more than comfortable. When Harrison entered the cabin that evening, She greeted him with a smile and immediately set about making coffee while Violet served the stew she'd spent all afternoon perfecting. They ate at the rough wooden table, and conversation flowed more easily than Violet had expected. Harrison told them about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about how he and Ellen had come west after their parents died. He spoke of learning to cowboy on the big ranches down in Texas, of saving every penny to buy his own land. He told funny stories about cattle drives and ornery horses, about building the cabin and having the roof cave in twice before he got it right. In turn, Violet and Victoria shared memories of their childhood, of their parents who had worked so hard and died so young. They talked about the farm outside Denver, about the garden their mother had loved and the barn cats their father had secretly fed. They laughed together over Victoria's failed attempts to learn embroidery and Violet's childhood habit of climbing trees and tearing her dresses. As the weeks passed, these evening meals became routine. Harrison would come in after finishing the barn work, and they'd eat together by lamplight, sharing stories and planning the next day's tasks. Violet began to notice small things, how Harrison's laugh transformed his serious face, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when Victoria said something clever, how his voice gentled when he spoke about his sister. She also noticed how she felt in his presence. Safe, certainly, but something more than that. Interested. Aware. She found herself choosing her words more carefully when he was near, caring about his opinion in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. November arrived with a vengeance, bringing snow that piled waist-deep around the cabin. Harrison had prepared well, and the ranch settled into winter mode. The cattle huddled in the sheltered valleys, the chickens stayed in their insulated coop, and the humans ventured out only for necessary chores before retreating to warmth and shelter. On a particularly cold evening, with wind howling around the cabin and snow pelting the windows, Harrison taught them to play poker for matchsticks. Victoria proved surprisingly good at bluffing, while Violet couldn't hide her reactions to save her life. They laughed until their sides hurt when Harrison tried to explain the finer points of strategy and Violet accidentally revealed her hand. "You'd be terrible in a real game," Harrison said, grinning. "Every thought shows on your face." "Then it's good I'm not planning to become a gambler," Violet retorted, throwing a matchstick at him. He caught it easily, and their eyes met across the table. Something passed between them, a moment of connection that made Violet's breath catch. Harrison's smile faded, replaced by an expression she couldn't quite read, and then Victoria yawned dramatically and announced she was going to bed. After Victoria climbed to the loft, Violet and Harrison sat in awkward silence, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Harrison stood and reached for his coat. "I should get back to the barn." "It's freezing out there," Violet said. "The wind's terrible. I've got a good stove in the tack room. I'll be fine." "Harrison," Violet stood, her heart pounding, "why do you really sleep in the barn?" He turned to face her, and in the firelight she could see the conflict in his expression. "You know why. Tell me anyway." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "Because you're a beautiful woman living under my roof, and I'm a man who bought your contract. The power difference is wrong. If I stayed in here, if I let myself get too close, it wouldn't be right." Violet felt her face flush. "What if I don't think it's wrong, Violet?" Her name was almost a plea. "You're grateful, that's natural. But gratitude isn't the same as actual feelings, and I won't take advantage of that confusion." "You think I'm confused?" Violet stepped closer, anger flaring beneath her words. "I'm 19 years old, not a child. I know the difference between gratitude and what I'm feeling when I look at you." Harrison's jaw clenched. "And what are you feeling?" "Like maybe fate sent me to that auction block because somehow, impossibly, I needed to meet you." Like every time you smile at something Victoria says, my heart gets bigger. Like I want to know everything about you, want to hear all your stories and learn all your thoughts. Like when you're not around, something's missing. The words hung between them, raw and honest. Harrison stared at her with an expression that might have been pain or hope or both. "I bought your contract," he said hoarsely. "Legally, I own you for 5 more years. That's not a foundation for anything real. Then tear up the contract, right now." Violet lifted her chin. "Make us free and then tell me if you still think I'm just confused." Harrison's eyes searched her face. Slowly, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out 2 folded papers. The contracts. He'd been carrying them over his heart this whole time. He looked at them for a long moment, then walked to the fireplace and dropped them into the flames. The papers caught instantly, curling and blackening as fire consumed the legal claims to Violet's and Victoria's labor. "There," Harrison said, watching the papers burn. "You're free. Both of you. You can leave tomorrow if you want or stay as long as you like as paid employees. Your choice." Violet felt tears sting her eyes. "You really mean it? You're just letting us go?" "I always meant to. I just didn't expect." Harrison trailed off, then started again. "I didn't expect to feel this way about you. And I'm terrified I'm reading this all wrong. That I'm seeing something that isn't really there because I've been alone too long. And you're kind and brave. And you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep." Violet closed the distance between them in 3 steps and took his calloused hand in hers. "You're not reading it wrong. I promise you're not reading it wrong." Harrison's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a touch so gentle it made her shiver. "I need to court you properly. Do this right. Your sister's upstairs and we need to be respectful." "We will be," Violet promised. "But Harrison, you should know that I'm not going anywhere. Free or contracted, I'm staying right here. With you." The smile that broke across Harrison's face was like sunrise over the mountains. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, then stepped back reluctantly. "I'll see you in the morning," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Sleep well, Violet." After he left, Violet stood staring at the fire where the contracts had burned, her palm still warm from his kiss. From the loft, Victoria's voice drifted down. "I'm happy for you. He's a good man." Violet smiled into the darkness. The best man. Winter deepened, and so did the connection between Violet and Harrison. He courted her in the old-fashioned way despite the unconventional circumstances. He carved her a wooden comb and presented it shyly over breakfast. He always served her first at meals. He sought her opinion on ranch decisions and listened seriously to her suggestions. When they worked side by side, their hands would brush and linger, stolen moments of contact that made Violet's heart race. Victoria watched it all with approval, becoming an enthusiastic co-conspirator in giving them moments alone together. She'd volunteer to check on chickens that didn't need checking, or suddenly remember something she needed to do in the loft, leaving Violet and Harrison sitting by the fire, talking late into the night. They talked about everything. Harrison told her about Ellen, really told her, sharing memories both beautiful and painful. He spoke of his guilt that he hadn't found her sooner, his anger at the men who had hurt her, his grief at losing her. "She was funny," he said one evening, staring into the fire. Everyone always talked about how pretty she was, but they missed that she had this wicked sense of humor. She could do impressions that would make you cry laughing, and she was fearless. When we were kids, she was always the first one to try anything dangerous. "She sounds wonderful," Violet said softly. She was. And then they took all that light and just extinguished it. By the time I found her, she wouldn't even look me in the eye. She flinched at shadows, and I couldn't fix it. I tried everything, but I couldn't make her whole again. Violet took his hand. You couldn't fix it because what they did to her wasn't something that could be fixed, but you gave her a safe place. You gave her love. That mattered, even if it wasn't enough to heal all the wounds. Harrison gripped her hand like a lifeline. When I saw you on that auction block, I saw her. I saw a chance to do it right this time, to save someone before they went through what she endured. I never expected to find. He looked up, meeting her eyes. I never expected to find you. I'm glad you did, Violet whispered. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, his lips warm against her skin. It was their first real kiss, chaste but full of promise, and Violet felt it all the way down to her toes. December brought Christmas preparations. Victoria and Violet made decorations from pine boughs, and red ribbon purchased on a supply run to town. They baked cookies and pies, filling the cabin with the scents of cinnamon and vanilla. Harrison disappeared for an entire day and returned with a small pine tree, which they decorated with popcorn strings and paper snowflakes. On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts. Victoria gave them each a pair of knitted mittens she'd made in secret. Violet presented Harrison with a new shirt she'd sewn from fabric she'd bought with her saved wages. Harrison gave Victoria a beautiful hand-bound journal with blank pages for writing, and he gave Violet a delicate silver necklace with a small turquoise stone. "It was my mother's," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "Ellen wore it for a while, but she told me before she died that I should give it to someone special someday. I think she'd be happy knowing you have it." Violet touched the stone, feeling the weight of the gift in more than just silver. This was a family heirloom, a piece of his past and his heart. She turned and kissed him, a real kiss this time, soft and sweet and full of love. Victoria discreetly busied herself with stoking the fire. January and February were the hardest months. Snow piled so high they had to dig tunnels to reach the barn. The cattle required constant attention, and one particularly bad storm claimed 3 calves, despite everyone's best efforts. The loss hit Harrison hard, and Violet learned that loving him meant sharing not just the good days but the bad ones too. She found him in the barn after they'd buried the calves, sitting in the tack room with his head in his hands. She sat beside him, not speaking, just present. After a long while, he leaned against her shoulder. "Some years, ranching is just loss after loss," he said tiredly. "You pour everything into keeping them alive, and nature takes them anyway." "But you save more than you lose," Violet reminded him. "The rest of the herd is healthy because of you. Because you planned and prepared and worked yourself half to death keeping them fed and sheltered. Doesn't feel like enough. It's more than enough. You're more than enough." She turned his face toward hers. "I love you, Harrison Zeller. Bad days and good days and all the days in between." She saw his eyes widen, saw him process what she'd just said. Then he pulled her close and kissed her with a desperation that spoke of loneliness finally ended, of hearts finding home. "I love you too," he breathed against her lips. "God, Violet, I love you so much it scares me." "Don't be scared," she whispered. "We're in this together." March brought the first signs of spring, and with the warming weather came change. Harrison rode to Black Hawk with Violet sitting beside him on the wagon seat, their hands clasped between them where Victoria couldn't see from her perch in the back. They made the trip to stock up on supplies, but Harrison had another purpose. In town, he stopped first at the general store, then at the small church at the edge of the main street. Violet watched, confused, as he spoke quietly with the minister. When he returned to the wagon, his expression was both nervous and determined. That evening, after Victoria had gone to bed, Harrison asked Violet to walk with him. They strolled to the creek, swollen with snowmelt, and stood listening to the rush of water in the darkness. I talked to Reverend Matthews today, Harrison said. He's willing to come to the ranch next month to perform a wedding ceremony. Violet's heart stopped. A wedding! Harrison turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I know we haven't been courting long, and I know our beginning was anything but conventional. But Violet, I can't imagine my life without you in it. You've taken this lonely ranch and turned it into a home. You've taken a grieving man and given him a reason to smile again. I love you more than I have words to say, and I want to spend every day of the rest of my life showing you how much you mean to me. He knelt in the grass, still holding her hands. Violet Grayson, will you marry me? Tears streamed down Violet's face as she pulled him to his feet. Yes. Yes, Harrison, I'll marry you. I would be honored to be your wife. He kissed her there by the creek under a sky full of stars, and Violet felt the last pieces of her broken past fall away. She had been sold like property, been rescued by a stranger, been given freedom and love and a future she had never dared to dream of. And now she was choosing to bind herself to Harrison not from obligation or gratitude, but from pure, joyful love. Victoria's reaction the next morning was everything Violet had hoped for. She screamed with delight, hugged them both so hard they could barely breathe, and immediately began planning the celebration. We need flowers, Victoria declared, and I'll make you a dress. Oh, Violet, you're going to be the most beautiful bride. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Harrison worked on expanding the cabin, adding a separate bedroom so Victoria would have privacy after the wedding. Victoria sewed Violet a dress of cream-colored muslin with blue ribbon trim, working by candlelight to finish it in time. Violet cooked and cleaned and helped with the ranch work, but her mind was full of the future, of becoming Harrison's wife, of building a life together in this mountain sanctuary. The wedding took place on a bright April morning with wildflowers blooming across the meadow. Reverend Matthews arrived as promised, accompanied by Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house and a few other respectable townspeople Harrison had befriended. They gathered in front of the cabin, with the mountains standing witness and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine. Violet wore her new dress and her mother's wedding ring, which Victoria had somehow managed to retrieve from the banker in Denver during a secret trip to town. Harrison wore a new suit he'd bought specially for the occasion, looking so handsome that Violet's breath caught when she saw him. Victoria stood beside her as she spoke her vows, Harrison's strong hands holding hers, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed her with such tenderness that several of the witnesses wiped away tears. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Mrs. Patterson had brought a cake, and there was music from a fiddle player who worked at the livery stable. They danced in the meadow, ate until they were full, and toasted the couple with fresh spring water since neither Harrison nor Violet held with alcohol. As the sun set and the guests prepared to return to town, Victoria hugged her sister tightly. "I'm so happy for you," she whispered. "You deserve this. You deserve every bit of happiness." "So do you," Violet said fiercely. "Your time will come too." That night, after Victoria had discreetly retired to the barn to give the newlyweds privacy, Harrison carried Violet over the threshold of their expanded cabin and into the new bedroom he'd built. In the lamplight, with the door closed and the world far away, they came together as husband and wife, their love made physical in gentle touches and whispered promises. Later, lying in Harrison's arms with her head on his chest, Violet marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the auction block to this bed, from despair to joy, from being sold to choosing freely to give her heart to this remarkable man. "What are you thinking?" Harrison asked, his fingers trailing through her long hair. "That I love you," that I'm grateful for every twist of fate that led me to you, even the terrible parts, that I want to grow old with you on this ranch and raise babies who look like you and watch the seasons change together for the rest of our lives." Harrison tightened his arms around her. "I want all of that too. Every single bit of it." The months that followed were the happiest of Violet's life. She and Harrison fell into the rhythm of married life, working the ranch together, making plans for the future, stealing kisses in the barn when Victoria wasn't looking. The cattle prospered, the garden flourished, and by midsummer, Violet began to suspect she might be carrying Harrison's child. When she told him, sitting by the creek on an August evening, Harrison's face transformed with wonder and a little bit of fear. "A baby, are you sure?" "Pretty sure. I've missed 2 months now, and I've been sick most mornings." Harrison pulled her close, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "A baby, our baby. Violet, I'm going to be a father." "You're going to be a wonderful father," Violet assured him. "Patient and kind and strong. This baby is so lucky." Victoria was equally thrilled at the news of her impending aunthood. She immediately began knitting tiny clothes and helping Violet prepare the loft as a nursery. Harrison became almost comically protective, refusing to let Violet lift anything heavy and worrying whenever she ventured more than a few feet from the cabin. "Harrison, I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Violet protested one morning when he tried to forbid her from gathering eggs. "I just want to keep you safe," he said, looking so earnestly worried that Violet's irritation melted away. "I am safe. We're safe, but you have to let me keep working or I'll go crazy." They compromised, with Violet continuing her chores but agreeing to rest more often and let Harrison handle the heavier tasks. As her belly grew, so did their excitement. Harrison built a beautiful cradle from pine wood, carved with flowers and animals. Victoria sewed quilts and gowns. They talked late into the night about names and futures, about teaching their child to ride and showing them the beauty of these mountains. The baby arrived on a cold February night during a snowstorm, almost exactly a year after Violet and Harrison had first declared their love for each other. The local midwife had made it to the ranch just before the roads became impassable, and she guided Violet through the long, difficult hours of labor. Harrison paced in the main room, desperate to be with his wife, but banned from the birthing room by the midwife's strict orders. Victoria stayed with Violet, holding her hand and wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when the pain seemed unbearable. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, a baby's cry filled the cabin. The midwife emerged with a small, red-faced bundle and a broad smile. "Congratulations, Mr. Zeller. You have a healthy son." Harrison's hands shook as he took his child for the first time. The baby was tiny, wrinkled, perfect. Dark hair covered his small head, and when he opened his eyes, they were blue like his father's. Harrison felt his heart crack open with a love so fierce it nearly brought him to his knees. "Can I see my wife?" he asked hoarsely. "She's exhausted but fine. Go on in." Violet lay propped up in their bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiating joy. When she saw Harrison holding their son, tears spilled down her cheeks. "Look what we made," she whispered as Harrison sat beside her, placing the baby in her arms. "He's perfect. You're perfect." Harrison kissed her forehead, then the baby's. "Thank you for this gift. For him, for our family, for everything." They named him Henry Zeller, after Harrison's father. Little Henry was a healthy, hungry baby who quickly became the center of their world. Harrison proved to be exactly the kind of father Violet had known he would be, patient and gentle, singing to Henry in the middle of the night, and never complaining about the disruption to his sleep. Victoria adored her nephew, spending hours rocking him and making silly faces to earn his first smiles. As spring arrived and Henry grew stronger, the cabin rang with laughter and the sounds of new life. One evening in May, as Violet nursed Henry in the rocking chair Harrison had built for her, Victoria approached with news of her own. A young man from town, a carpenter named Thomas, had been courting her for several months. He'd asked her to marry him, and she had said yes. "I wanted to make sure you were all right with it," Victoria said anxiously. "I don't want to leave you short-handed with the baby." "Victoria, I'm thrilled," Violet said sincerely. "Thomas is a good man. You deserve happiness. And you're not leaving me, you're just starting your own life." "That's what was supposed to happen. I'll miss living here, though, miss being with you every day. We'll only be 15 miles apart. You can visit whenever you want, and Henry will need his aunt." Victoria's wedding took place in July, a joyful occasion that brought together the small community that had formed around the ranch. Harrison gave Victoria away, walking her down the makeshift aisle with pride. Thomas was clearly besotted with his bride, and Victoria glowed with happiness. After the wedding, as Victoria prepared to move to town with her new husband, she pulled Violet aside for a private moment. "Do you remember that day at the auction block, when we thought our lives were over?" "Every detail," Violet said. "We were so wrong. Our lives weren't ending. They were just beginning." Victoria hugged her sister tightly. "Thank you for never giving up on me, for fighting to keep us together." "Always," Violet promised. "No matter where we are, we're sisters. Nothing will ever change that." The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Harrison expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land when it became available, building their herd until the Rocking Z became known throughout the territory for quality cattle. Violet ran the household and helped with the business, her sharp mind for numbers making her an invaluable partner in every decision. Henry grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to ride almost before he could walk. 2 years after Henry's birth, Violet gave Harrison a daughter they named Eleanor, after his mother. Eleanor had Violet's green eyes and sunny disposition, and she had Harrison wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she was born. Victoria and Thomas built a good life in Black Hawk, where Thomas's carpentry business thrived. They had children of their own, 2 daughters and a son, and the cousins grew up visiting back and forth between town and ranch, forming bonds that would last their whole lives. As the years turned into decades, as the wild frontier gradually became more settled and civilized, Violet and Harrison grew old together on the ranch they'd built with their own hands. They added on to the cabin multiple times, turning it from a simple one-room structure into a sprawling house filled with children and grandchildren. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Harrison took Violet back to the spot by the creek where he'd proposed. They were both graying now, their hands weathered by work, their faces lined by time and sun. But when Harrison looked at Violet, he still saw the brave young woman who had stood on an auction block with defiance burning in her green eyes. "You ever regret it?" he asked, taking her hand. "That you ended up here with me instead of somewhere else, living some different life?" Violet looked at the ranch spread out before them, at the house where their grandchildren were probably causing chaos, at the mountains that had witnessed every moment of their life together. She thought about the girl she'd been, terrified and desperate, and the woman she'd become, strong and loved and free. "Regret," she said, smiling up at her husband. "Harrison, you saved my life. You gave me back my sister, gave me a home and a family and a love I didn't even know existed. If I could go back and choose any path, any possible life, I'd choose this one. I choose you. Every single time." Harrison pulled her close and kissed her there by the creek, the same way he'd kissed her as a young husband all those years ago. Some things changed with time, but others remained constant. The love between them, the strength of their bond, the gratitude for a stranger who had stepped up at an auction block and changed the course of two sisters' lives forever. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, Violet rested her head on Harrison's shoulder and felt completely at peace. They had built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, had turned a chance encounter into a lifetime of love. And that, she thought, was the truest kind of happy ending anyone could ask for. The ranch would continue for generations, passed down to Henry and then to his children. The story of how Harrison saved Violet and Victoria would become family legend, told to each new generation as a reminder that sometimes heroes appear when you least expect them, that love can bloom in the darkest places, and that family is worth fighting for. But all of that was still to come. For now, on this perfect evening, Violet and Harrison simply held each other and watched the stars emerge one by one over the mountains, grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them together and kept them that way. They had started as buyer and bought, as rescuer and rescued, but they had become so much more. Partners, lovers, best friends, parents, grandparents, and above all, two souls who had found their home in each other. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of wildflowers and mountain snow. Somewhere in the house, a grandchild laughed. A horse whinnied in the corral. The creek murmured its endless song. And Violet Zeller, who had once stood in chains on an auction block, smiled and knew that she was the richest woman in the world. Years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of mountain seasons. Harrison's dark hair turned silver, though his blue eyes remained as sharp as ever. Violet's face gained lines from decades of smiling, each wrinkle a testament to a life well lived. They worked the ranch together until their bodies no longer allowed it. Then they supervised from the porch, offering wisdom to Henry and his wife as they took over the daily operations. Eleanor married a schoolteacher and moved to Denver, where she opened a school for girls that became renowned throughout the territory. She visited the ranch every summer with her children, filling the house with books and laughter. Victoria remained in Black Hawk until Thomas's death at age 68, after which she moved back to the ranch to spend her final years with her sister. The two women, now grandmothers themselves, would sit on the porch in their rocking chairs and remember aloud that terrible autumn day in 1876, when they'd been separated at dawn and reunited by dusk through the intervention of a young cowboy with a good heart. "You think he knew?" Victoria asked one afternoon, her voice still strong despite her 70 years. "When he bought your contract, do you think Harrison knew he was falling in love with you?" Violet considered the question, watching her husband across the yard as he showed his great-grandson how to properly oil a saddle. Even bent with age, Harrison moved with purpose and grace. "I think he knew something," Violet said softly. "I think when our eyes met that day, something in both of us recognized something in the other, a kindred spirit, a missing piece." "It was fate," Victoria declared. "Had to be. What are the odds that a man like Harrison would be in Black Hawk on that specific day, that he'd have the money and the courage to do what he did, that he'd be willing to take on two sisters instead of just one? Fate or providence or simple human decency," Violet agreed. "Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it every single day." As the afternoon sun painted the mountains gold, Henry came up to the porch with news. A young family had approached him about buying a section of the ranch, the western meadow where the Zellers rarely ran cattle anymore. The family's story was familiar. Orphaned siblings trying to make a start with nothing but determination and hope. Harrison and Violet exchanged a long look, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in a single glance. "Sell it to them," Harrison said. "For whatever they can afford to pay, even if it's just a promise to pay later." "Are you sure, Pa?" Henry asked. "That's prime land, worth a lot more than they're offering." "I'm sure," Harrison said firmly. "Your mother and I built this ranch from nothing because someone gave us a chance when we needed it most. Now it's our turn to do the same for someone else." Henry nodded, understanding. The deal was struck that evening, and the young family moved onto their section with tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. Harrison and Violet watched them settle in, remembering themselves at that age, full of dreams and determination. The following spring brought both joy and sorrow. Eleanor gave birth to twin girls, healthy and strong. But Victoria, who had seemed fine the day before, passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 73. They buried her on a hillside overlooking the ranch, next to the plot where Harrison had already indicated he wanted to rest when his time came. Violet grieved deeply for the sister, who had been her constant companion through the worst and best moments of her life. But she found comfort in knowing that Victoria had lived to see her own children grown and happy, had known love and safety and joy after the terror of that early trauma. "She had a good life," Harrison said, holding Violet as she cried. "You gave her that. By refusing to give up on her, by making me help find her, you gave Victoria decades of happiness she might never have had." "We gave her that," Violet corrected. "You're the one who spent $700 and faced down Caleb Morton. You're the one who bought us both and set us free." Harrison was quiet for a moment. "You know, I never told you this, but that $700 was everything I had. I'd been saving for years to expand the ranch, to buy more cattle. I spent it all in one day on two women I'd never met." Violet pulled back to look at him in surprise. "You never said. All this time I thought you were wealthy. Far from it. I was land rich and cash poor like most ranchers. But when I saw you on that auction block when you told me about Victoria, I knew the money didn't matter. I could always earn more money. But I couldn't live with myself if I walked away and did nothing. You gave up your dreams for us." "No," Harrison said, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "I thought I was giving up my dreams, but what I actually did was trade one dream for a better one. The ranch expansion could wait." "You couldn't." Violet kissed him, tasting salt from her tears and the sweetness of his enduring love. "I love you, Harrison Zeller. For 50 years now I've loved you. And I love you, Violet Zeller, will for the rest of my days and whatever comes after." Those days continued for several more years. Harrison and Violet celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary with a massive gathering that brought together children and great-grandchildren from across Colorado. The party lasted 3 days, with music and dancing and stories shared around bonfires under the stars. On the final night of the celebration, Harrison stood with difficulty and raised a glass of apple cider. "I want to thank you all for being here," he said, his voice still strong despite his 82 years. "For those of you who don't know the story, your grandmother and I met under unusual circumstances. She was in trouble, and I was in the right place at the right time to help. But the truth is, she saved me as much as I saved her. Before Violet, I was just surviving, working to forget the pain of losing my sister. Violet taught me to live again, to love again, to believe that good things were still possible. She gave me a family and a purpose, and a reason to keep going even when times were hard. So here's to my beautiful wife, who has been my partner and my best friend for half a century. May we have many more years together." The crowd cheered and drank, but Violet saw the shadow that crossed Harrison's face when he thought no one was looking. She knew him too well. Something was wrong. Her fears were confirmed 2 weeks later when Harrison collapsed while working in the barn. The doctor from Black Hawk made the long journey to the ranch and delivered the news Violet had been dreading. Harrison's heart was failing. There was nothing to be done except make him comfortable. Harrison took the news with characteristic calm. "How long?" he asked the doctor. "Impossible to say for certain. Could be weeks, could be months, but not years, I'm afraid." After the doctor left, Violet sat beside Harrison's bed and held his hand. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Harrison broke the silence. "I'm not afraid to die," he said quietly. "I've had a good life, a better life than I ever expected. The only thing that breaks my heart is leaving you." "Then don't leave," Violet said fiercely, though she knew it was futile. "Fight this. Stay with me, Violet." Harrison's voice was infinitely gentle. "You know I would if I could. But some things are beyond even stubbornness to fix. My body is worn out. I've worked it hard for 82 years and it's ready to rest." Tears streamed down Violet's face. "I don't know how to be without you." "Yes, you do. You're the strongest person I've ever known. You survived things that would have broken most people. You'll survive this too." "I don't want to survive it. I want to keep you." Harrison pulled her close, and they lay together in the bed they'd shared for 50 years, holding each other as the afternoon light faded into evening. Over the next weeks, as Harrison grew weaker, Violet barely left his side. Henry and Alina took turns staying at the ranch, helping with their father's care and supporting their mother. Harrison remained lucid until the end, spending his final days reminiscing about their life together. He told stories Violet had heard 100 times but never tired of hearing. Their wedding day, the birth of their children, the year they nearly lost everything to drought, but survived through determination and luck. He made Violet promise to keep living after he was gone, to spend time with their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to not waste years grieving when she could be enjoying the family they'd built together. "Promise me," Harrison insisted, his voice weak but urgent. "Promise you'll keep going." "I promise," Violet whispered, though she couldn't imagine how. Harrison died on a clear October morning with the aspens golden on the mountainsides, exactly 53 years after he'd first seen Violet on an auction block in Black Hawk. He passed peacefully, holding Violet's hand with their children gathered around the bed. His last words were, "Thank you for choosing me." The funeral brought people from across the territory, a testament to the man Harrison had been and the lives he'd touched. They buried him on the hillside next to Victoria, overlooking the ranch he'd built and the valley he'd loved. Violet stood at the graveside, supported by her children, and said goodbye to her heart. The months that followed were the hardest of Violet's life, harder even than those desperate days before Harrison had saved her. She had been young then, with fear but also hope. Now she was old and tired, and the future stretched before her empty and cold. Only her promise to Harrison kept her going, forcing her to rise each morning and face another day without him. Slowly, painfully, she learned to live in a world without Harrison. She found comfort in her grandchildren, who filled the house with noise and life. She helped Henry's wife with the household management, teaching her the skills Violet had learned over decades. She wrote down the family history, wanting future generations to know the story of how their family had begun. On what would have been their 55th wedding anniversary, Violet made the journey to Harrison's grave. She was 84 now, frail but still sharp-minded. She sat on the bench Henry had placed beside the grave and talked to her husband as if he could hear her. "I kept my promise," she told him. "I've been living, not just surviving. The ranch is thriving under Henry's management. Alina's school is educating hundreds of girls. We have 14 great-grandchildren now, did I tell you that? 14. And every single one of them knows your story, knows what you did for me and Victoria. You're their hero." She paused, listening to the wind in the pines. "I'm ready now," she said softly. "Ready to join you. I've done what you asked. I've lived and loved and made sure our family knows where they came from. But I miss you, Harrison. I miss you every single day. So when it's time, I'll be ready." Violet died in her sleep 3 weeks later on a snowy November night. Henry found her in the morning, lying peacefully in the bed she'd shared with Harrison, a small smile on her face. They buried her beside her husband on the hillside, and the whole territory mourned the passing of a remarkable woman. But the story didn't end there. It lived on in the ranch that continued to prosper, in the school Eleanor had founded, in the young family Harrison and Violet had helped purchase land, who eventually became successful ranchers themselves, and passed on the generosity they'd been shown. The story lived on in every Zeller descendant who heard the tale of the auction block and the cowboy, who learned that sometimes heroes are just ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. Years became decades. Decades became a century. The rocking Z remained in the family, passed down through generations. The original cabin Harrison built was preserved as a historical landmark, and the hillside graves where Harrison, Violet, and Victoria rested became a family shrine, visited by descendants who wanted to pay respects to the couple who had started it all. On the 100th anniversary of Harrison and Violet's wedding, more than 300 of their descendants gathered at the ranch for a reunion. They stood on the hillside and heard the story retold. How Violet had been sold at auction, how Harrison had bought her freedom, how he'd rescued Victoria and brought the sisters back together. How love had bloomed in the shadow of trauma, how two people from desperate circumstances had built a life of joy and purpose. The youngest descendant present, a 5-year-old girl with green eyes like her great-great-great-grandmother, laid wildflowers on Violet's grave. Was she really a princess? The little girl asked her mother. "No, sweetheart," her mother said, smiling. "She was something better. She was a survivor who became a hero in her own right. She was a woman who refused to give up, who fought for her sister, who built a life from nothing. And she was lucky enough to find a man who saw her worth when the whole world was trying to tell her she had none." "I want to be like her," the little girl declared. "Then be brave," her mother said. "Be kind. Fight for the people you love. And when someone needs help, be the one who steps forward, just like Harrison did." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky the same colors it had painted 125 years earlier, when a young cowboy had stepped up to an auction block and changed the course of history, the Zeller family celebrated the legacy of love and courage that had started it all. The ranch stood strong, the mountains stood eternal, and somewhere in the wind that whispered through the pines, you could almost hear the echo of two souls who had found each other against all odds and loved each other until death and beyond. And that was the true ending, not in death but in legacy, not in sorrow but in the knowledge that one act of courage had rippled forward through time, creating families and futures that might never have existed. Harrison saved Violet, Violet saved Victoria, and together they saved countless others through their example, their generosity, and their unwavering belief that every person deserves dignity, freedom, and love. The story that began on an auction block in 1876 lived on, proof that even in the darkest moments, hope survives. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, hope brings with it a hero on a dusty street in a Colorado mining town, ready to buy your freedom and offer you forever.